Good morning. With a good heart, as a member of St. Peter's Lutheran Church, it is my honor to acknowledge and recognize the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, and the Attawandaron, or neutral people, who for centuries before contact with Europeans lived on and took care of the land upon which we now reside. Let us remember them and also take care of this land which was so cruelly taken from them. Yesterday, National Truth and Reconciliation Day, is also known as Orange Shirt Day to remember the cruelty suffered by children who were taken from their parents to go away to residential schools. Children such as Phyllis Webstadt, who was a little girl starting her first day at residential school, wearing a new orange shirt, of which she was so proud to be able to wear on her first day of school. However, when she arrived at school, her beautiful new shirt was removed from her. Her hair was cut. She was made to take a bath with lye soap. She was given a uniform to wear, and she never saw her lovely orange shirt again. This is just an example of the impact that residential schools has on the lives of so many Indigenous children. We must all remember the thousands of children just like Phyllis and renew our commitment to reconciliation by taking the time to learn the truth about residential schools in Ontario. And the children, not only Ontario, in Canada, the children who never arrived back home, and the ongoing intergenerational harm that resulted.
Thank you, Sherri. So, Orange Shirt Day. I want to thank Sherri for writing that land acknowledgement that gives us some of the background about what it is that we are marking as a country on September 30th. It began as Orange Shirt Day and is now a national day for truth and reconciliation. The books that I pointed out to, I wasn't quite sure, so I'm glad that Sherri included pieces about Phyllis Webstadt's story. And the two books that I have here are some storybooks that also tell the story of Orange Shirt Day. So if you're interested during fellowship time, please come and take a look. One's from the library, because I couldn't find this one, so especially maybe be gentle with this one, because I've got to take it back. But what I did find online, I was going to read one of those, and then I found on the Orange Shirt website, Phyllis's story in her own words. And so it includes some of what Sherri said, but also gives a little bit of what happened later on in her life and how, oh yes, please put that slide up. I totally forgot that Bonnie had put this together for me. So yes, so Phyllis Webstadt, and there are some photos of her as a school child, her as an adult, and that's a picture of her with her son. So those images to look at while we listen to some of her words. So this is Phyllis saying, I went to the mission school for one school year in 1973-74. I had just turned 6 years old. I lived with my grandmother on the Dog Creek Reserve. We never had very much money, but somehow my granny managed to buy me a new outfit to go to the mission school. I remember going to Robinson's store and picking out a shiny orange shirt. It had string laced up in front and was so bright and exciting, just like I felt to be going to school. When I got to the mission, they stripped me and took away my clothes, including the orange shirt. I never wore it again. And I didn't understand why they wouldn't give it back to me. It was mine. The color orange has always reminded me of that and how my feelings didn't matter, how no one cared, and how I felt like I was worth nothing. All of us little children were crying and no one cared. I was 13 years old and in grade 8 when my son Jeremy was born. Because my grandmother and mother both attended residential school for 10 years each, I never knew what a parent was supposed to be like. With the help of my aunt, Agnes Jack, I was able to raise my son and have him know me as his mother. I went to a treatment center for healing when I was 27 and have been on this healing journey since then. I finally get it, that the feeling of worthlessness and insignificance ingrained in me from that first day at the mission affected the way I lived my life for many years. Even now, when I know nothing could be further than the truth, I still sometimes feel that I don't matter, even with all the work I've done. I'm honored to be able to tell my story so that others may benefit and understand, and maybe other survivors will feel comfortable enough to share their stories. I think it's so helpful to hear her reflections on how that experience impacted her later in life, and that touches on some of the things that Sherri named, right, of the intergenerational trauma and the challenges through the generations, with different generations of a family attending residential school. And certainly we can look at Phyllis's story and say, well, it's not nearly as horrific as some of the other stories we may have heard, but it's comparisons I don't think are helpful, right? And she shares about how that messaging she received, how damaging and traumatizing that was for her, and the ways that impacted her life. So the orange shirt, the reason we wear this, or we wear orange, is it symbolizes all of the things that Indigenous peoples have had taken away from them. And I think the message that comes from Phyllis's experience and the story she shares is a really important one to hang on to, and it's one that if you have one of the official Orange Shirt Day shirts, right, is right on there. Every child matters, right? That is a message that she struggled and had to learn for herself, having gone through an experience where she realized that she wasn't treated as if she mattered. So thankful for her sharing that story and that message. Our Bible story today, which we'll hear in just a few moments, is one that lifts up some themes of freedom, of liberation. We hear about Abraham and Sarah's descendants who are now slaves in Egypt. Right? They traveled there many years ago during a time of famine. And God calls on one of their descendants, a man named Moses, right? Someone who is a large figure in the Hebrew scriptures. God calls on Moses to help free the people from slavery. And so as we hear this story of Moses being raised up to be this leader for his people, as we hear this in light of the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, it's an invitation for us to think more deeply about what is the kind of freedom that God desires for all of us. As we prepare to hear God's word to us in the sacred story of Scripture, let's take a moment to pray. God of deliverance, you called Moses to be your hands, feet, and voice in a troubled world. Teach us how to work, walk, and speak your word in this troubled world. Amen. As you are able, I invite you to stand for our acclamation.
Prophets' voices hold, the morning light of promise of salvation shines ever as of old. The word is like a bush forever burning, the word pours down like showers on the land. The word is like the sun our faces warming, God's power till the down to earth when all was ready, made our time, made our space, our dwelling place. The word is sheltered near the heart of Mary, brings us to birth in grace. what thy gospel is to live. To love and weep with us in joy and sorrow, to know us yet forgive. O Lord, you are the yes of all God's promise. Amen, we shout in you, our faith is sure. O lead us to the light of God's own presence, to life forevermore.
You may be seated as we listen to the story.
A passage from Exodus chapter 3, verses 1 to 15. May we be equipped by these words to walk in love for God, ourselves, our neighbors, and all people and all God's creation. Moses was taking care of the flock for his father-in-law, Jethro, Midian's priest. He led his flock out to the edge of the desert, and he came to God's mountain called Horeb. The Lord's messenger appeared to him in a flame of fire in the middle of a bush. Moses saw that the bush was in flames, but it didn't burn up. Then Moses said to himself, "Let me check out this amazing sight and find out why the bush isn't burning up." When the Lord saw that he was coming to look, God called to him out of the bush, "Moses, Moses." Moses said, "I'm here." Then the Lord said, "Don't come any closer. Take off your sandals, because you are standing on holy ground." He continued, "I am the God of your father, Abraham's God, Isaac's God, and Jacob's God." Moses hid his face because he was afraid to look at God. Then the Lord said, "I've clearly seen my people oppressed in Egypt. I've heard their cry of injustice because of their slave masters. I know about their pain. I've come down to rescue them from the Egyptians in order to take them out of that land and bring them to a good and broad land, a land that's full of milk and honey, a place where the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites all live. Now the Israelites' cry of injustice have reached me. I've seen just how much the Egyptians have oppressed them. So get going. I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt." But Moses said to God, "Who am I to go to Pharaoh and to bring the Israelites out of Egypt?" God said, "I'll be with you, and this will show you that I'm the one who sent you. After you bring the people out of Egypt, you will come back here and worship God on this mountain." But Moses said to God, If I now come to the Israelites and say to them, 'The God of your ancestors has sent me to you,' they are going to ask me, 'What's this God's name?' What am I supposed to say to them?" God said to Moses, "I am who I am. Say to the Israelites, 'I am has sent me to you.'" God continued, "Say to the Israelites, 'The Lord, the God of your ancestors, Abraham's God, Isaac's God, and Jacob's God, has sent me to you. This is my name forever. This is how all generations will remember me." The living God is with us.
And with all creation, thanks be to God. Thanks, Kim. So it has been some 500 years now, right? We've been making our way through some of these families in the Old Testament, from Abraham and Sarah, Isaac and Jacob. But we're 500 years now from Abraham and Sarah and that promise that was made to them about having descendants that would number the stars, to the story that we just heard. And in that 500 years, that promise has come true, right? There are descendants who now live in Egypt after traveling there in Jacob's day because there was a famine and they were seeking relief, right? They came to Egypt, and they are now, all these generations later, so strong in numbers that the Pharaoh is afraid of them. And out of this fear, he has decided that he better try controlling them in some way, right? So first he makes them work harder, and then he enslaves them. And it seems that the more the people are oppressed, well, they only grow more in number. And so it pushes the Pharaoh, that fear pushes him to take even more drastic measures. And this is where we get to one of those places in the Bible that's not so nice, right? There's a lot of those stories, unfortunately, right? The Pharaoh, well, he commands the midwives that when they're attending birth, that they should kill any of the babies if they're boys. But that doesn't work, because thankfully those midwives, they find a clever way to subvert that command. They don't participate in that plan. But the Pharaoh doesn't relent, right? He then goes even further and just orders all of the baby boys to be thrown into the river. This is the world that Moses is born into, right? This world of fear, of danger, of oppression, and injustice. And perhaps you know this part of the story too, right? The only thing that Moses' mother can think to do is to put her precious little baby boy in a basket in the river. A dangerous option, for sure, right? But it is an act of faith that ends up saving Moses' life. Because the Pharaoh's daughter, of all people, happens upon this basket, and she decides to raise him as her own, which is a really interesting piece that think about in this story, right? We don't ever know what caused her to make that decision, but she knows that it is a Hebrew baby. She says as much in the story. So she makes that decision knowing that this is one of those babies that her father wants gone. So Moses is a Hebrew living in Pharaoh's palace, and he ends up walking in both worlds. Right, he enjoys the privileges of living with the Pharaoh and his family, but he is always a Hebrew at heart. And chances are maybe there's people in his life who remind him of that too. And that's perhaps why when he's out for a walk one day, he can't stand by and do nothing when he sees an Egyptian beating a Hebrew. Right, he takes a quick look around just to make sure nobody's watching him, and he kills the Egyptian and then hides his body in the sand. And even though there were no witnesses, Moses fears for his life, and so he runs away. He goes kind of as far away as he can get to the middle of nowhere, to this place called Midian. He gets married there, and he settles down to a nice, quiet life as a shepherd, right? As far away as he can get from those problems back in Egypt. Moses' origin story is a reminder, I think, to us that none of us get to choose the circumstances we're born into. All right, certainly if it were up to us, we'd have some suggestions, some pointers, some requests for God, right? Because we know, looking around and from our experience, we know that the world is inequitable, right? And no one would choose to be born into a place of disadvantage. And like Moses, we also are born into, we inherit a history that we didn't write, but it impacts our present reality in countless ways. And of course, here in Canada, one of the pieces of that history is both the history and the ongoing impacts of colonization. Our church, right, we're part of the Evangelical Lutheran Church in Canada, and the history of this particular denomination is an immigrant church, right? Our congregations were established by immigrants who mostly came from places like Germany and Eastern Europe, from the Nordic countries, who came here and settled in this land. And that word, settlers, is a word that can be challenging, I think, for us. I'm really thankful, and this is a plug for our book and our book study, that one of the things that Pastor Matthew Anderson talks about in this book, Our Home and Treaty Land, is this word settlers. And he says this: some Canadians don't like that term, but it's accurate. A useful definition of a settler is someone whose uninvited arrival means the assimilation or removal of those first living in that place. Migrants come to an existing political system and try to fit in. Settler colonists are part of creating and maintaining a new state. So I think that is a helpful distinction to think about, right? That all of us, unless we are Indigenous, we are all settlers on this land. And that's not something, I mean, some of us came to this country, and I don't think we were choosing that part of the history when we came here, right? People came to create a better life for their families, this place where there was opportunity, where maybe in the old country that didn't exist. But this is the history of this land, no matter when we arrived here. And it's hard and painful work to face the truth of that history, right? The colonialism in this land, and the ways that it's not just history, right? It continues to perpetuate inequality and injustice today. This isn't just something that happened in the past. It happens today and carries on today. It continues in the way that Indigenous communities don't have the same access to things like education or clean water. It continues in the way that Indigenous communities don't have title and ownership to so much of their traditional territory. And of course, that means they don't have the wealth and the access to the wealth that goes along with having that ownership in our economic system. It continues in the intergenerational trauma that was brought about by the dehumanization of Indigenous peoples through things like the residential schools, but other policies through the Indian Act. Countless ways we tried to erase and silence Indigenous culture and language. And as settlers, most of us, and we have the privilege of ignoring these things if we so choose, right? We can say that they don't really directly impact us in some ways. But as Christians, God calls us to notice, to pay attention, to respond. I think not unlike the way that God reached out to Moses in the wilderness of Midian, right? Moses, who thought he had gotten away from all of those problems, away from that history. He was just minding his own business, right? Tending his sheep. Probably one day, just like all the other days before, when a fire catches his eye, right? And of course, I'm sure, I can imagine a burning bush. A fire is something you'd want to pay attention to, right? A wildfire is not a good thing. But Moses also notices then something about this particular fire is really unusual. So maybe if he was first caught his attention by the fact there was a fire, he notices that this fire is different. He sees this bush is burning, but the bush doesn't burn up. So he's curious, and he goes to take a closer look. And it's that split-second decision that I'm sure he maybe regretted at certain points later in his life, right? Because that decision turned his life upside down and put him into some really challenging and scary situations. Because, of course, that fire was no ordinary fire. It was God. I am who I am, with a message for Moses, right? God tells Moses that God has heard the Israelites' cries for liberation and freedom, and that God is ready to do something about it. Or rather, God is ready to have Moses do something about it. Moses, who would most certainly probably rather go anywhere than back to the land that he fled from as a fugitive. But God doesn't let him say no. God promises to be with him and to help him along the way. So as we think about Moses and the burning bush and the story in light of the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, I hope that we can hear in this story an invitation to be like Moses and to practice that art of noticing and responding, right? To pay attention to the burning bushes, calling our country toward justice. Those residential school survivors who have fought courageously and tirelessly for recognition and reparation, for truth and reconciliation to take root here. I hope that in this story we can seek to have what Brian McLaren calls Moses' eyes. right? Moses' eyes, to be on the lookout for people who are being oppressed and mistreated. In this instance, though, we are not the ones, unlike Moses, to do the leading or the liberating, right? Because within Indigenous communities, so many wise, strong, and courageous leaders have been raised up to bring healing, to help do that work of regaining language and culture, and calling for reparations, right? They know what their communities need, and if we listen, they are there calling for those things. Sometimes we have to go looking for it because it doesn't always make it into the mainstream media or other channels, right? But those voices are there. And our place as settlers is to do that work first of listening, of learning, and then, yes, responding, right? Acting by coming alongside of Indigenous communities in their work for justice, reparations, and equal treatment, right? We are part of doing that work alongside them to build a country where every child does matter. Because I think if one thing is clear from this burning bush moment in the Midian wilderness, if one thing is clear, injustice, inequality, and dehumanization are not part of God's vision for our world. I am who I am comes to Moses, telling him and telling us that I am who I am desires liberation and freedom for every one of us, and that without equality, there is no true freedom for any of us. I invite you to pray with me. Faithful God, we remember the many, many Indigenous children who did not return from residential school. Grant comfort in the midst of grief and trauma. Renew our commitment to the journey of truth-telling, mourning, and responsibility, and guide us in your ways of healing and love. Amen. For our hymn of the day today, it picks up in a part of the story that I didn't preach a lot about, right? The last part of the story, God reveals God's name to Moses. And I was thinking about that, and the reason I chose this hymn for us as our hymn of the day is I think it helps us think about who God is, who God has revealed God's self to be to us, and what that means for us living in the world. It's from our new hymnal supplement, All Creation Sings, and like so many of those hymns, just has beautiful words that I hope we can rest in as we sing together. And we will not be singing it to the tune that's in that book. It's a familiar tune, one you will know. So I hope that with a familiar tune, these new words will resonate with us this morning. I'll invite you to stand as you are able as we sing together.
Share